Everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the country in the 1970s, and as a whole, I think we would give it a diagnosis of depression. That the whole country was feeling sad. So there were some foreign policy developments that would certainly make people feel sad, like the idea that Nixon was a cheater and a liar, and he had to step down from office. That's something that made the country feel sad. The information about the Vietnam War that was out, that the government lied to the American public about the Tonkin Gulf incident, that had come out. The fact that the war, the military draft was unevenly applied and people with political connections could get out of it. And other people had to go and serve and risk their lives. That made people feel sad. There were protests throughout the 1960s against the war and in the beginning of the 70s against the war. We saw the incident at Kent State when the government pulled in the National Guard and shot into the crowd of people. And we can, hear a lot about that in the news today, is making a comparison between our modern day government using the National Guard against protesters, particularly in Washington, D.C., that incident that hit the news recently. Okay, so, and the assassinations from the 1960s between John F. Kennedy getting killed, Martin Luther King Jr. getting killed, and Medgar Evers, another civil rights leader, Malcolm X, another civil rights leader who was killed, and then Bobby Kennedy, the brother of John Kennedy, who was a Democratic presidential candidate. He was running for president, and he was very much in favor of civil rights, and he was also killed. So people felt kind of sad, and you can understand that. There was a lot going on. Okay, so then Ford took over after Nixon had resigned. So he was the only president in American history who was not elected on a national ticket. So let's just give a little bit of background here, that Nixon ran and his vice president was a man named Spiro Agnew. And Agnew was associated with corruption of his own, and he was forced to resign. So Nixon was elected with Agnew, and while Agnew was vice president, he was forced out. So then there was an opening for the vice president, so Nixon picked Ford from the House of Representatives. Remember, so Ford was elected to the House of Representatives from a district in Texas, and so those people elected him to the House. Nixon picked him, and then the House of Representatives voted and said yes. So he was not elected on a national scale, Ford. He was elected by his people in Texas and then chosen by Nixon. So then once he was president, when Nixon resigned, Ford issued a pardon to President Nixon. And that was designed to kind of end the nightmare and just move on. But a lot of people were dissatisfied with that because a lot of Nixon's advisors went to jail. 40 of his advisors went to jail, and Nixon got off scot-free. Okay, then other people who dodged the draft, meaning they were sent a draft card and they ran away to another country or went into hiding here, those people are known as draft dodgers. And they were not pardoned, but given clemency, which means they were forgiven, but their records were not clear. So they didn't have to worry about going to jail. And then later, others were pardoned by Jimmy Carter. And so again, this created this feeling of unfairness. Another development in the 1970s pertains to the economy, something called stagflation. Stagflation is a mashup of two words: stagnancy, meaning the economy is not growing, and inflation, meaning higher prices. Okay, now this is a very unusual situation because normally when people are unemployed and they don't have money to spend, stores will lower their prices to try to attract consumers to buy and spend whatever they have. But because of an oil shortage that I'll talk about in a minute, prices went up at the same time that unemployment was going up. So this was a very strange economic situation that no economists had seen before. They didn't study it in school. They didn't know how to deal with it. So it was very difficult. And the rising oil prices were due to a new group that was created called OPEC, which stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So the countries who had most of the oil in the world said, you know what, we've got a lot of power here, so let's band together and let's raise the prices because everybody has to buy from us. So it's almost like a monopoly, but it's with a group of people, or in this case, a group of countries who had the oil. So they charged a tremendous amount of money for oil, and that's what caused the inflation. And then there was an oil embargo, meaning that OPEC decided not to sell oil to the United States. So we were really in a bind then. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So overall, this question here, how might these events have contributed to a feeling of depression? Nixon didn't get punished while many of his subordinates went to jail. Some people were granted clemency or pardon for evading the military draft, and others went to fight, and so these gave the appearances of an unjust system. Stagflation was a new economic problem that economists did not know how to fix. And then the U.S. became an oil importer, meaning we did not have enough of this essential resource to operate, and so that created a new vulnerability for the United States. We were dependent on another country, and OPEC took advantage of this by raising the price. Okay, so then Carter was elected in the election of 1976, and only 53% of the voters voted. And that's known as voter apathy, which is a dangerous situation because if people don't vote, then you wind up with candidates that people don't really like. And so Carter was elected, and he had to deal with inflation and unemployment at the same time. So he's still dealing with stagflation and this oil embargo. And the prices of everything went up because of oil, if you think about what gas and petroleum is used for. So you have home heating oil. So every place that heats their facility in the winter, they're going to have to raise their prices. But oil also goes into plastic, fertilizers, paint, and ink. Who would have ever thought about these things as linked to oil? But they are. So prices of everything went up. And now the United States became it had a new problem called a trade deficit. The nation was buying more foreign goods than it exported. So that means American dollars are flowing out of the country. And that was a new problem. Because remember, the United States, after World War I, had been the leading exporter and producer in the world. And so we came very far from that spot. Going on to some environmental problems, we see some corporations not doing so well because of stagflation, and then the government gave them huge loans to keep them in business. And so some people kind of looked at that and said, why is the government giving handouts to business when they're not giving handouts to people? A new problem was defined called acid rain, which is toxic air pollution. And that was made famous by a book called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. I'm going to add that in there. Everybody should know her name. That's like just something that everybody knows. And so Nixon, as a Republican, created the Environmental Protection Agency. And laws were passed called the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And these were really good for the environment. And it's interesting that Nixon did such a thing as a Republican, because now we see the Republicans dismantling and undoing all of the rules, or many of the rules that were put in place, and trying to weaken the Clean Air Act and weaken the Clean Water Act. And so Nixon would probably be kicked out of the Republican Party today because the Republican Party has moved so far to the right. And Carter would also put solar panels on the White House, trying to make a statement that we're going to move away from our dependence on foreign oil. But you'll notice there are no solar panels on the White House because in the 1980s, Reagan was president and he took down the solar panels because he didn't, he was a conservative and he didn't believe that the United States needed to change its behavior. He felt that it was better to, continue to embrace fossil fuels. And so, had the country continued on this more environmentally sound path, who knows where we would be today. Okay, so then as an alternative to coal and oil because of these problems, the country looked to nuclear energy, and then there was a terrible disaster at 3 Mile Island, which was a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania, and the radiation got out and got into the air, and the people around that area had a major increase in lung cancer and leukemia and a spike in infant mortality 2 years after the accident. And so people were really turned off by nuclear energy. And you would see people walking around with, they would protest no nukes, and they would wear signs pins that said that, and things like that. And this also contributed to a feeling of depression because there seemed to be no solution to our energy shortages. And inside the country, this oil shortage caused a lot of problems. So you have rationing, where you could buy gas one day and not the next, depending on your license plate number. And it was so tense, you even have people getting into fights at the gas station and even gas pump homicides. And so these events also contributed to a feeling of depression because it showed that the U.S. could become unraveled by a group of foreign countries due to its dependence on foreign oil. And this is a picture of one of the new cars that people started driving in the 70s because they needed to have more fuel-efficient cars. But a lot of Americans didn't want to do that because, cars had always been the symbol of American freedom. And why should we allow these foreign nations to dictate what type of car we have to buy? So that also created resentment and depression. And in terms of foreign affairs, we see American power declining in the world. Jimmy Carter agreed to give back the Panama Canal in accordance with our earlier treaty. If you recall, we got that stretch of land, and we built the canal, and we only had a 99-year lease over that land. And Carter said yes, and when the time comes, we're going to return it because we're not going to be an imperial power. We're not going to take over places that don't want us there. And so that was Carter's attitude, but he was criticized for that as being wimpy and giving up power. We also have the situation in Iran, which was not helpful. The United States had helped to install the Shah in 1953 in Iran. So he was the leader of Iran, put in place with help by the United States. And unfortunately, he was a dictator and used brutal measures against his people. And in 1978, there were a lot of demonstrations against him, and this is known as the Iranian Revolution. And so the new leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, was a fundamentalist. And so this is, he installed fundamentalist ideas in Iran. And right after he came to power, he broke off diplomatic relations with the United States, and they broke into the American embassy in Iran and took 52 staff members hostage. Okay, so this is shown in the movie Argo. For those of you who've seen that, that's a good movie. And it depicts what happened here. And then Carter tried to free the hostages, but he couldn't. He eventually negotiated their release, but they would not release the hostages until after Jimmy Carter was out of office. And so Ronald Reagan came into office, and then within 30 minutes, the hostages were freed. And so for those of you who watched the video on this during the 9/11 lesson, you see Reagan taking the credit. Oh, our hostages are finally home. It was a fabulous moment in American history, but it was not really Ronald Reagan's doing. Okay, going on to U.S.-Soviet relations. This is still the Cold War. It's still going on, but Carter followed the policy of détente. And then the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. So this is an example of communism trying to spread, and we are still following our policy of containment. But Carter said, no, we're not going to send troops. When we send troops into Vietnam, look what happened. So he's coming fresh off the memory of Vietnam. And he said, we're not going to send troops to Afghanistan. And so he cut off grain shipment sales to the Soviet Union and boycotted the 1980 Summer Olympics, which were held in Moscow. And again, he was criticized, saying this was not a strong position, that we should have been forceful. And then when Reagan came into office, he did actually send aid to the people in Afghanistan fighting the Soviet Union. So that was a contrast there. How might these events have contributed to a feeling of depression? It seemed like American power in the world was on the decline. Okay, so going back to our aim today, why was America depressed in the 1970s? To give you an opportunity to respond on our AIM response sheet. Thank you. Have a great day.